Hello, Algebra students. We begin Unit 10 today, and Unit 10 is one of my all-time favorite topics for mathematics, and it deals with statistics and data analysis. And there are so many connections to real life in this unit, and it's fun because you can actually see how it could possibly apply to yourself and the people around you. So hopefully we can make this interesting, pull lots of real life situations that can help you out. But I intend that this chapter would be pretty interesting for you. We start out in lesson 1 talking about how to analyze surveys and samples. So just kind of to initially get some of this vocabulary out here, a survey is basically, you probably know what a survey is, but if we had to define it, you could say it's a study of a characteristic of a certain group. Okay, so you got a group of people you want to find something out about, and so you collect some data about that certain characteristic about that group, and that's called a survey. And you've probably been parts of surveys before. Our school certainly sends out lots of surveys, teacher surveys, telling how much you like or dislike a teacher, school surveys, things that you like and dislike about the school, and of course there's always online surveys that you're being asked to take. It's a very, very popular part of our culture these days, is taking surveys and then getting surveyed. The population is considered the whole group. So for instance, when you're electing a president for a country, the population would be everybody in the entire country. Okay? However, usually it's not very practical to survey everyone in the entire country, especially when your population is very large, like a school population. It's tough to get everyone to be part of that survey, and so you usually survey a sample of that population. So a sample is just a smaller set of the population. And usually it's a little bit more convenient to survey that sample than it is to survey every single person. Now, the most important thing we're going to be talking about today is this idea of something being biased. We read all sorts of statistics and data and all that, either online or in books, or we read it or watch it in videos, and we have to be able to determine on our own whether or not things are biased, because, they're trying to get us to believe something, and, that might be false. They might have had some biased data, and so you need to be able to determine what is biased and what is not. A biased sample would be a non-representative group of people. One of the famous stories here of a biased sample is a number of years ago, decades ago, there was an election in the United States, and they took a survey of a sample of the population of the United States, and they were 100% sure that this one candidate was going to win. Now, this candidate typically represented wealthy people, and the way that they did this survey was they called people on the telephone. Now, this was decades ago, before everyone had telephones. In fact, really only the rich people had telephones at that point. And so they called all these people to survey them, and of course, only rich people had phones. And so all these rich people who had the phones who were getting surveyed said that they wanted this particular candidate. Well, they didn't serve anybody who didn't have phones, and of course at that point there were more people without phones than with phones. And so while, according to this survey, it was the rich candidate who was the clear favorite, when it came down to actually voting, well, it was the candidate who supported the poor people that wound up winning in somewhat of a landslide, and there were a lot of newspapers who had already printed that the rich candidate had won. And so this is an example of a biased sample. They were surveying the wrong people. It wasn't a general group of people that was surveyed. It was a specific type of person, and that skewed the data. Now, a biased question. This is a pretty important thing, especially when it comes to testing. There's been a lot of controversy when it comes to testing in schools regarding biased questions. But a biased question, it encourages a particular response. And so, if you ask a question a certain way, well, people are naturally going to ask you or respond in predictable manners. It all depends on how you ask it. I think one of the most common things here is, on tests, teachers will maybe ask questions that students don't know anything about. I know that coming to Korea, I started my problem-solving questions. I would ask things that were real common in American culture, but people who had grown up in Korean culture had never even heard of these things before. Those are biased questions. They were biased towards people who knew something about American culture. And so we have to be very careful to know what the questions specifically ask and how they're asked. Okay, example 1. Some examples of surveys and samples. So, owners of a computer store survey computers to see whether or not they should expand their game selection. They survey customers in the game aisle. Okay, that makes sense. The question says, identify the population. Well, the population is customers. So, computer store customers. Okay, and there's actually a number of different survey methods or sampling methods. There's random sampling, where you just kind of randomly pick people. There's systematic, where you're using a certain rule to select members of the population. There's convenience, where it's only the people who are easily accessible to the person who's doing the survey. And then there's self-selected, where you're only selecting people who are volunteering. Typically, that's not always too representative. So, if we had to pick here, I'd say this is probably a random. It's we're only picking people who randomly come. You might be able to call it a convenience thing, because it's convenient that they're just surveying people who are in that particular aisle. There's another kind where it's called stratified random sample, and that means that you're dividing a population into distinct groups. And so here, if the population is computer store customers, okay, that's pretty random, just the people who walk in, but this might be considered more stratified random because not only is it just random people who come in, but it's the customers in the particular game aisle that are coming in. So that's kind of how we think about population and classifying the sampling method. All right, moving on. Here we do some analysis. It says, suppose the owners randomly survey all customers at the store on a Saturday. Is this method likely to result in a biased sample? Well, you got to think to yourself here. There's a lot of factors at play. So, who comes to a store on a Saturday? It might be different than the people who come to the store on a weekday. On a Saturday, who's really going to come in? Well, probably people that have to work or go to school. So workers, students are much more likely to come in. Young people maybe would be more likely to come in on a weekend. So is this likely to result in a biased sample? Well, it may be. It's kind of a spectrum, right? There's no yes or no answer. That's one of the great things about most of math, is that there usually are right and wrong answers. But in this, there's kind of a spectrum. Is it more or biased than something else? I would have to say, if 0 was completely biased, and I guess maybe 0 is completely unbiased, and 10 was completely biased, I'd say that maybe it falls somewhere, maybe like a 6 or a 7. So at least they're surveying all customers, not just the people in one particular aisle, but it is on a Saturday, and so that could likely skew the data. All right, here's another one. Is this question survey biased? Is this a biased survey question? Well, the question is, are the teachers at YIS paid enough money? Well, when you think about it like that, are you paid enough money? Well, what do you naturally think when you ask this question? And paid enough money, that's another relative question. Are these teachers paid enough to a certain lifestyle? That would be a more specific question, as opposed to as opposed to something else. So again, on a spectrum, 0 to 10, 10 being totally biased, or sorry, unbiased, and 10 being completely biased, I'd say maybe this is an 8 for being biased. I think if you ask a teacher, teacher might say no. But if you were paying tuition and you were worried about how much your tuition was going up, you might say yes. Of course, they get paid enough money. All right. Well, that kind of takes us through survey sampling and a lot of the vocabulary here. We start next time, lesson 2, talking about measures of central tendency, which is some of the particular ways that we analyze survey data.